Hello. In this video I want to review the new Whatifalthist video about communism, and it is called Why Communism is a Failed Religion. And I have to admit, in the first part of his video I found myself agreeing with him. I also make this comparison of communism and religion. I also found many similarities between communism and religion, and to be honest, we are not the first guys that noticed this. Edgar Snow, who wrote the book Red Star Above China in the late 1930s, already calls a war of nationalists versus communists in China a holy war. He does it to emphasize the fanaticism and dogmatic thinking that existed in both sides of the conflict. But okay, let me start. And I'll focus on the parts where I disagree and where I found his logic to just be extremely fallacious and just non-objective. So what he does is this, in this video, I would call the crime of omission. He just mentions the part of reality that are in line with his previous conclusions. So, okay, let us start.
For example, take John Lennon's song Imagine, which posits a world without heaven, hell, nothing to live for or die for, where there is no division or suffering. This is a very feminine ideal for life, since women are not competitive, and when I first heard the song, I didn't know why other people found it attractive. A world where everyone gets the same is one where the stupidest, worst, and laziest person from your high school gets the exact same as you, no matter how hard you work or try to improve yourself. It's one where there are literally no adventures, and a life without meaning or purpose. For men, it's generally a rule that if there's nothing worth dying for, there's also nothing worth living for.
Okay, my friend, so where's the problem? You're conflating the hippie utopia of John Lennon, let's have peace and smoke weed for all eternity, with Marxism of the 20th century, with the communist regimes that actually existed in the 20th century, and all of them had a pretty strong cult of masculinity, especially, for example, Mao Zedong and Tito. The case that they made to their people is, well, we fought you on the battlefield. We were there when we were outnumbered by fascists 10 to 1, and we stuck with you. We fought bravely. The revolution is paved with our blood. So yeah, there was a pretty strong cult of masculinity, and George Orwell even argues that what makes communism and fascism actually so popular is this call to have an adventure, to sacrifice yourself for the cause, while liberal capitalism, on the other hand, George Orwell argues, is just about preserving individual rights that already exist, and it's not that inspiring, it's not that interesting. I mean, it becomes something worth dying for only when there is an ideology that discriminates you and is coming for you and your family. Then you suddenly start to appreciate just this liberal world of individual rights. I would agree, but it's not that inspiring, like communism or even fascism. That's what George Orwell claims, and I would even agree. And my other problem with what he just said is, he says, who would like to live in a world where the laziest and the dumbest guy from your high school gets the same amount of money as you? Well, my friend, you are forgetting how fallen and how flawed this world we live in is. I also live in a liberal democratic state, and I mean, I'm glad I'm not living in a dictatorship, but my friend, look around you. I mean, do you really believe that people at the top are all there because they are honest and hardworking? Most politicians in my country have some form of connection to the criminal underground. Most politicians are corrupt, in my country at least, and I would argue in the United States as well. Most rich people broke the law in some way, either through hiding taxation, using illegal forms of suppressing their competition, like Bill Gates, for example. Google it if you don't believe me. So yeah, this guy, I would assume he's inspired by this Protestant view that those that rise to the top are rewarded by God for being virtuous and good, but reality contradicts that view. unfortunately. But okay, let us continue.
That's not life. That's a still painting, where the characters are spiritually already dead. However, many people found Imagine to sound like a paradise on an intuitive basis. Something I'm not going to cover in as much depth here because I've already spent a lot of time in these two videos explaining it, is that societies are often driven by guiding emotions, with guilt being the one in the West, shame in most Asian societies and other cultures around the world are fear in tribal groups, and communism's driving emotion is envy, and that the thing that motivates people to have the revolution is the destruction of the rich. And then the second the communists do kill the rich, they start to cannibalize their own social structure, meaning they have no other system of values. You can tell that communism's driven off envy due to its continued popularity with intellectuals, even though it's failed countless times and killed millions, and if they actually care about helping the poor, they would look at ideologies that have been successful at it. And when you see communism, they kill the rich and even middle-class people, and what they end up doing is they make the poor starve, and so they care more about hurting the haves than helping the poor, which is the definition of envy.
Okay, wait a minute, my friend. Wait a minute, my friend. So many things to comment on in such a short time. So, he says communism is mostly supported by intellectuals that are envious. But okay, let's look at who was it that actually fought on the battlefield and got the communist parties in power. It was mostly the poor peasants and poor workers in Russia and China. And so why were millions of people so attracted to communism? Well, first of all, wealth redistribution is just popular, especially in Russia and China, where those at the bottom barely had enough to live, and starvation was just a part of life. And Mao Zedong grew up in an environment where he constantly saw people around him dying from hunger. And so yeah, Mao and Stalin, they didn't invent famines. I mean, look up the 1892 huge famine in the Tsarist Russia. That famine, according to some historians, discredited the imperial regime to such an extent that it made communism, in comparison to monarchism, much more popular. And of course, people at the time didn't know that communism will also result in massive famines. But okay, my point is, it's not like famines don't exist under capitalism. Or let's also talk about China before Mao. Well, the Great Leap Forward truly was, I believe, the biggest famine in the history of humanity, and I have a video about it, so check it out. But many mini famines that happened in various local areas in China existed before Mao Zedong, while China was just a collection of warlords fighting each other. For example, Google the Great Northwestern Famine, and that is a perfect example of capitalist greed killing 6 million people. So the warlords forced the peasants to grow opium instead of food. And what a surprise, there wasn't enough food, because then the drought happened and just millions of people died. And Edgar Snow even talks about people eating leaves and wood, and the children just dying. And I would also argue that Mao Zedong, since he grew up in such society, was kind of desensitized to violence and famine. And Mao Zedong, when asked by his comrades, how can you be so cruel and have so little empathy for the peasants? Well, he really gave memorable answers. For example, first he said, well, if people didn't die, then there wouldn't be place for new people to be born. And then later he proceeded to say, and this is my favorite Mao Zedong quote, dead people, well, they fertilize the ground. So yeah, in many ways, my problem with Maoism is that it was, in many aspects, it couldn't fix many of the problems that already existed in China. But okay, the totalitarian aspect was something new. But I mean, most historians would argue that without these huge flaws that pre-existed communism, or the countries in which communism eventually came to the top, there wouldn't be communism if what pre-existed, communism was better and was less just horrible for the people. I mean, we are in Russia. We are literally talking. In some factories, the workers couldn't even marry without the capitalists giving them permission. That was some unholy mixture of feudalism and capitalism. And I mean, in the Soviet Russia, at least, if you're just a normal guy, you could marry pretty much whoever you wanted to. Of course, not a political opponent, since they would be probably in a gulag somewhere. But yeah, this guy also is just forgetting that Soviets actually did improve lives of those at the bottom in many ways, at least if we are talking about the Brezhnev era. So people in Russia who are old enough are still nostalgic about the Brezhnev era. They are nostalgic about the fact that everybody had a job, that there was a good social security, that there was less crime than in the Putin era, that their state was actually respected on the international stage for fighting colonialism, unlike Russia today, that more money was invested into like areas, for example, in the Far East and in the smaller towns. More money was invested than today in Putin's Russia. So yeah, this guy also fails to compare communism with capitalism today in Russia and China, and with what pre-existed it. But okay, let us continue. Okay, let's continue.
Said before as well, Jewish people have been extremely disproportionate in communist movements over history. Ted Kaczynski, or the Unabomber, has said one of the most prescient things I've ever seen about the left. He said that they were a reaction to over-socialization in the modern world. People are much less free today than we imagine. Almost everyone in the pre-modern world had their own little farm and had authority over their families even if they were desperately poor. They lived in villages and only dealt with people they knew for their whole lives. The nanny state wouldn't get into your face about starting bar fights, and you didn't have a boss to say you couldn't grab some drinks with your friend at lunch. However, modernity makes people feel much less powerful, and like they are ants living in apartment buildings, not knowing their neighbors, working for a boss who doesn't care about them at all in a uniform large corporation, dealing with impersonal bureaucracies all the time, even in dating with dating apps. Well, a bureaucratic school raises you and your kids. This creates a subconscious desire of power and impotence at our lack of power against the bureaucratic machine that is modern life. We know.
Okay, let me just say. So, I do agree that there are some things that are kind of unnatural in modern life because we simply didn't evolve to live in, let's say, apartments or. Well, what's interesting, he mentions. I at least believe so, that he implies that he dislikes Tinder and this the fact that Tinder kind of turns dating into a market. And Slavoj Žižek actually makes a funny case that even Marx couldn't have predicted how far capitalism would go, that even dating would become a market. And so, okay, to me it seems that this guy is also very critical of capitalism that exists today, and of the fact that kind of people have less families, often even less friends than before. So I don't know what would be his explanation for that. I mean, I do see this as a bizarre consequence of capitalism or our modern society, actually. But okay, it's interesting that this guy then also dislikes the idea that dating has become a market on Tinder. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm not sure what would he then suggest. And yeah, he mentions that in today's day and age it is harder to have bar fights, and that the nanny state doesn't want to let you have bar fights. Well, okay, I don't think that the world would be a much better place if we had more bar fights. And in fact, most people that actually know how to fight will tell you, well, don't start a fight if you have to. If you have to respond with violence, then do it. But don't start a fight because, well, even if you win, you can get in trouble because, I know some guys that now actually have problems with the law because they went too far during the fight, and this one guy broke a guy's jaw, and now he's in trouble. So, yeah, I don't think more bar fights would make our society better. But okay, let's see what this guy has to say.
No, communism isn't driven off poverty. Poverty is the norm across human history, and communism is incredibly recent in its current form. Almost every era dealt with poverty through religion, which by all accounts is a much better choice. However, communism stems from a desire for power by disempowered people. Let's imagine this way. What would a power-hungry ideology from an era in which individual people feel like ants look like? It would want to get power for the powerless, and then would be resentful of any moral principles it could be judged against. Thus, it would claim to be perfect and then would execute a complete authoritarian power fantasy upon reaching power every time. At the same time, communism is driven by the two most over-socialized demographics, those being academics and the classes that are working for someone else in a large factory. All the demographics that have agency in their own lives, like small business owners, farmers, and others who are often still quite poor, tilt markedly conservative. If you want to kill communism forever, improve the strengths of families, small businesses, and religion. If we find a way to return to the pre-industrial norms of everyone running their own little plot of land or business, people will feel agency in their lives as well as being stakeholders, and communism will stop making sense. If people have intact families, they will view that as a sense of agency and stabilization in their lives, rather than turning to ideologies to balance the void in their souls. My favorite history writer, Amaury Durignancourt, said communism is revenge by Mother Nature against the modern world killing religion and respect for the natural order. Humans by...
Okay, let me just say, well, I do think that for most people it is good to have a family and that some things were maybe better in the past, but that depends on how far you want to go. War was still a phenomenon that was seen quite often during the 20th century. So I think the people often have this tendency to idealize the past, while not realizing that it wasn't really so great to live in the past. Imagine being one of those guys that was born in the early 1900s. So you had to go through the First World War, and then if you didn't die, there was the Second World War waiting for you. Or imagine being the generation in the United States that had to fight in the Vietnam War, or in Croatia having to fight in the Croatian War of Independence. So yeah, I'm not so sure that it was so much better in the past. I guess in some aspects it was, but in many aspects I would say that it wasn't. And what many historians have observed, all these ideologies that want to return to the golden past, that want to stop the wheel of time and go back, well, they all fail, and it cannot be done simply. So we need to find another solution. What is that solution? I don't know. But okay, I think I'll finish my video with this.